Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Whispering Man. The old house stood alone at the edge of Blackwood Forest, its wooden walls weathered by time, its windows dark like empty eyes. The town of Raven Hollow knew its legend, the house where people heard whispers in the night, where those who entered were never the same again. Daniel Graves had always been a skeptic, a journalist for the Midnight Chronicle. He made a career out of debunking urban legends. So, when he was assigned to write about the Whispering Man, he didn't hesitate. Just another ghost story, he muttered as he drove toward the abandoned house. The air grew heavier as he approached. The trees around the house twisted unnaturally, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers. As he stepped inside, dust swirled in the dim light of his flashlight. The floor creaked under his weight, and the smell of damp wood and decay filled his nostrils. Then he heard it. A whisper, software, incoherent, right behind him. Daniel spun around, his heart hammering. Nothing. Just an empty hallway stretching into darkness. He let out a breath and shook his head. Just my mind playing tricks. But the whispers continued. Daniel set up his recording equipment in the living room, determined to capture proof of whatever was haunting this place. He spoke into his recorder. March 12th, 11:45 p.m. Strange noises. Whispers. Possibly the wind through cracks in the walls. As the night deepened, the whispers grew clearer. At first, they were just unintelligible murmurs, but soon they began forming words. Daniel. Daniel. Leave. He stiffened. The voice was soft, almost pleading. He turned on his recorder and played it back. Silence. The whispers hadn't been recorded. A cold breath brushed against his neck. Daniel whipped around. No one was there. His flashlight flickered. The air in the room grew frigid. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. He grabbed his camera and pointed it toward the sound. His breath caught in his throat. A figure stood at the end of the hall. Tall, thin, shadowed. Its face was obscured, but its head tilted unnaturally, as if studying him. Then it whispered, "Let me in." The whisper was inside his head, curling around his thoughts like smoke. His vision blurred. His knees buckled. He collapsed, his mind sinking into darkness. Daniel awoke to sunlight streaming through the broken windows. His body ached, his head pounded, and his camera was gone. He stumbled outside, his mind a foggy mess. He needed answers. Back in town, he visited the local library, searching for any records about the house. After hours of digging, he found an article from 1896. Local physician Dr. Edgar Morrow found guilty of inhumane experiments. Townspeople claim to hear whispers in his abandoned home. Some say he still lingers, seeking new voices to join him. Daniel's stomach twisted. Dr. Morrow had been obsessed with death, believing that the human soul could be transferred through whispers. He kidnapped patients, performed grotesque experiments, forcing his victims to whisper their souls into him before they died. Daniel closed the book, his hands trembling. The Whispering Man wasn't just a ghost. He was something worse, something hungry, and Daniel had heard him. Daniel returned to his motel, determined to leave town in the morning. But that night, the whispers followed him. Daniel, Daniel, let me in. He pressed his hands to his ears. The whispering didn't stop. It seeped through the walls, the floor, the air itself. His reflection in the mirror twisted, its mouth moving on its own. "You brought me with you," Daniel screamed. By dawn, Daniel was a wreck. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale. The whispers were inside him now, slithering through his mind like parasites. There was only one way to stop it. He returned to the house. The moment he stepped inside, the whispers grew deafening. The air thickened, pressing against his chest. The shadowed figure emerged once more, its head tilting, its whisper digging into his skull. "Let me in." Daniel clutched his head. His own voice whispered back, "Yes." Darkness consumed him. A month later, another journalist was sent to investigate Daniel's disappearance. The house stood silent, but on some nights, if you listened closely, you could hear the whispers. "Let me in." Story 2. Don't look under the stairs. The old house on Willow Street had been abandoned for years before the Johnsons moved in. It was a Victorian-style mansion with creaking wooden floors, high ceilings, and a grand staircase that twisted up into the darkness of the second floor. The house was beautiful in its own eerie way, but something about it never felt quite right. The Johnsons had gotten it for a suspiciously low price, but they didn't ask questions. They were just happy to start fresh. Their son, Ethan, was 12 years old, an adventurous boy with a love for exploring. From the moment they moved in, Ethan was drawn to the basement door, which sat ominously beneath the grand staircase. It was locked. His parents told him to leave it alone. "It's probably just a storage area," his father said. "Don't worry about it." His mother was more firm. "Do not go near that door, Ethan. Ever." That only made him more curious. The first night in the house, Ethan woke to a soft sound, a faint whisper, like someone murmuring his name. He sat up in bed, heart pounding. He listened. Nothing. But as he lay back down, he heard it again. "Ethan, come here." It was coming from downstairs, from under the staircase. The whispering became a nightly occurrence. It was always soft, always calling his name. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was wrong somehow, and the worst part. Every night, the basement door seemed to open just a little wider. One evening, when his parents were out, Ethan finally gave in to his curiosity. He crept down the stairs, flashlight in hand, heart hammering against his ribs. The basement door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Holding his breath, he reached out and pushed the door open. The air inside was cold. Not just basement cold, but something else. Something unnatural. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the inky blackness. The basement was mostly empty, except for an old wooden staircase leading downward. Something moved in the shadows below. Ethan's breath hitched. He turned to leave. Bang! The door slammed shut behind him. The whispers turned into laughter. The laughter faded, replaced by the sound of something moving beneath him. The wooden steps creaked, as if something was crawling just underneath them. Ethan aimed his flashlight at the gaps between the steps. Something was there. Two eyes, impossibly large, staring at him through the slats. The face was too long, the mouth stretched into a grin too wide for any human. Its fingers, long, spindly things, reached through the gaps, scratching at the wood. "Come closer, Ethan," it whispered. Ethan stumbled back, but the thing beneath the stairs didn't stay hidden. It began to emerge. A long, skeletal arm slithered out first, then the rest of its body. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its pale skin stretched too tightly over its bones. It was tall, far too tall. Its head tilted as it grinned down at him. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing took a step forward. Something deep inside Ethan screamed at him to run. He turned, scrambling up the stairs. The creature's laughter echoed behind him as it scuttled after him on all fours, its fingers clicking against the wooden floor. He reached the door, yanking at the handle. Locked. A hand wrapped around his ankle. Ethan screamed, "Bang, bang, bang." The sound of someone pounding on the front door. His parents. The creature hissed and recoiled, slithering backward into the darkness. The basement door suddenly burst open, throwing Ethan onto the floor. His parents rushed in, panic on their faces. "Ethan, what happened?" Tears streamed down his face. "Something's down there." His father grabbed a flashlight and stormed into the basement. His mother held Ethan close, whispering that everything would be okay. But Ethan knew it wouldn't be. Minutes passed. His father returned, face pale, sweat beading his forehead. "There's nothing there," he said. Ethan stared at him, shaking his head. "No, it was there. It tried to." His father held up his hand. "I checked every inch. There's nothing." Ethan looked past him, at the basement door. It was open just a crack. A whisper slithered through the air, barely audible. "I'll be waiting, Ethan." The Johnsons sealed the basement door the next day, nailing heavy planks over it, but Ethan knew it wouldn't matter. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again. The whispering, coming from beneath the stairs. "You looked, Ethan. That means you belong to me now." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, pulling the blankets over his head. The last thing he heard before sleep finally took him was a soft, scratching sound. Something crawling, something waiting for him to look again. The end. Story 3. The Girl in the Mirror. Lena had always been fascinated by antique mirrors. When she moved into her grandmother's old house deep in the countryside, she was delighted to find a large, ornate mirror in the attic. Its frame was dark mahogany, carved with intricate floral patterns, and its glass was strangely pristine despite its age. Her grandmother, before passing, had warned her never to bring the mirror downstairs. But Lena, skeptical of old superstitions, ignored the warning. She hung it in her bedroom, right across from her bed. That night, as she lay under the heavy covers, she thought she heard something. Soft whispers. She dismissed it as the wind and fell asleep. The next morning, Lena felt uneasy. As she brushed her hair in front of the mirror, she noticed something strange. Her reflection was a fraction of a second too slow. When she tilted her head, the image followed, but there was the tiniest delay. "Maybe I'm just tired," she murmured. That evening, the whispering returned, but this time it was clearer. It came from the mirror. Lena sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark except for the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains. She forced herself to look at the mirror. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just her own reflection, sitting upright in bed, wide-eyed and afraid. Then it moved. Not her. The reflection. It smiled. Lena screamed. She scrambled out of bed, backing away until she hit the door. The reflection still sat there grinning, though her own lips were frozen in terror. Then the reflection stood up. Lena did not. The girl in the mirror pressed her hands against the glass, as if trying to push through. Lena's breath hitched as cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, the sound sharp and unnatural in the silent room. Then the girl whispered, her voice slithering into Lena's ears. "Let me out." Lena ran. She locked herself in the bathroom, panting. The whispers continued. "Let me out." They were in her head, beneath her skin. "Let me out, Lena." How did it know her name? Tears streamed down her face. She squeezed her eyes shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Silence. Lena slowly opened her eyes. The mirror above the sink showed her reflection. Just her. Shakily, she exhaled. Maybe she had imagined it all. Then her reflection blinked. She hadn't, because this time, she hadn't blinked. Lena barely had time to react before a freezing force seized her. It felt like fingers wrapping around her throat, pulling, dragging her forward. She fought, clawed at the porcelain sink, but the force was relentless. Her reflection smirked. Your turn. With a final violent tug, Lena was yanked into the mirror. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was herself. No, it. Standing where she had been, stretching its arms, rolling its shoulders, wearing her body like a costume. Then, silence. The next morning, Lena, or what looked like her, descended the stairs, smiling at her grandmother's old cat, which hissed and arched its back. The thing in Lena's body merely tilted its head, watching with cold amusement. Upstairs, in the mirror, behind the glass, Lena pounded and screamed, but no sound came out. Her reflection, the real one now, stared back at her with wide, terrified eyes, and then slowly, it turned away, forever trapped, forever watching. The girl in the mirror had found her replacement. Story 4. The Watcher in the Woods. A tale of terror and madness. The road leading to Black Hollow Forest was nearly abandoned, covered in thick fog that curled around the towering pines like ghostly fingers. Daniel and his wife Emily sat in their old SUV, the engine humming softly as they neared their new home, a cabin nestled deep within the woods. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice uneasy as she stared at the endless stretch of trees. Daniel squeezed her hand. "It's perfect. Isolated, peaceful, a fresh start." They had left the city behind after a tragedy neither wanted to talk about. The cabin, inherited from Daniel's late uncle, was their escape, but as they turned onto the narrow dirt path leading to it, Emily felt a deep primal unease settle in her stomach. The trees pressed close. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be, and then she saw it, a figure standing among the trees, tall, motionless, watching. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Daniel frowned. "See what?" She turned back. The figure was gone. Just the trees. Just the endless, whispering woods. The first night in the cabin was quiet. Almost too quiet. No cars, no city noise. Only the wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. Daniel fell asleep quickly, but Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. And then she heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping sound against the window. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned her head slowly. Outside, in the pale moonlight, a figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching. Her heart pounded. She reached out to wake Daniel, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. She lay frozen, unable to sleep, the sense of being watched burning into her skin. The next morning, Daniel went out to chop wood, while Emily explored the cabin. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, but something felt off. She stepped onto the porch and gasped. Deep gouges were etched into the wood beneath the windows. Long, claw-like marks. "Daniel," she called, her voice shaking. He hurried over, frowning at the scratches. "Must be a bear." Emily shook her head. "A bear doesn't just stand there and watch," Daniel sighed. "Em, you are probably dreaming. New place, new surroundings. It can mess with your head." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But then she saw the footprints. Not animal tracks, not Daniel's boots. Bare human footprints leading from the trees to the cabin, and nowhere else. As if someone had come to watch them in the night, then vanished. That evening, the air was heavy with the scent of rain. Emily sat on the porch, trying to shake the unease curling in her stomach. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint, distant, coming from the woods. She held her breath. The wind carried the words in a voice dry and rasping. You shouldn't be here. Her blood ran cold. The trees swayed, their dark shapes moving like living things. A shadow lingered just beyond the tree line. Daniel stepped outside. You okay? Emily turned to him, her face pale. There's someone out there. He grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing, just trees, just the whispering wind. Daniel exhaled. Emily, there's nothing. A branch snapped, then another. Something was out there. Daniel stepped forward. The flashlight flickered, then died. The woods swallowed the light, and from the darkness came the sound of breathing, heavy, ragged, close. Emily grabbed Daniel's arm. Get inside. They locked the doors, but outside, in the shadows, something stood watching, waiting. The following day, Daniel decided to check the woods. He took his hunting rifle and ventured into the trees, despite Emily's protests. Emily stayed inside, her heart hammering. The air was thick with silence. She watched from the window, waiting, praying. And then she saw it. Daniel was gone, but the figure was there, standing just at the tree line. Closer now. A long, gaunt shape wrapped in tattered black rags. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones. Hollow eyes stared at her, empty, yet filled with something ancient, something hungry. Emily stumbled back, her breath coming in gasps. She grabbed the phone, no signal. Then, footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate. She turned just as the door burst open. Daniel stood there, pale and shaking. We have to go, now. She didn't ask questions. She ran. They got into the car, speeding down the dirt road, Daniel's hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. What did you see? Emily asked. His face was hollow with fear. There's a clearing in the woods, graves, dozens of them, old and fresh, and something else. Emily swallowed. What? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. One of the graves had my name on it. A chill ran through her spine. Then, from the rearview mirror, the figure stood in the road, watching them leave, not trying to stop them, just watching. They never spoke of what happened in Black Hollow Forest. They never returned. But sometimes, late at night, Emily would wake up with the feeling of being watched. She would look out the window, and in the distance, at the edge of the trees, she would see it, tall, motionless, waiting, because the watcher in the woods never truly leaves, and once it has seen you, it never forgets. Story 5. Voices from the Closet, a horror story. The house was old, Victorian style, towering over the other homes in the quiet neighborhood. Tall, with sharp edges, and a history no one wanted to talk about. It was cheap, and for Mark and his wife Evelyn, it was perfect. They had just moved to the city, hoping for a fresh start. This place has character, Mark said, placing their last moving box inside. Evelyn shivered. It feels cold. The real estate agent had warned them that the previous owner had left in a hurry, abandoning most of their belongings. Strange circumstances, she'd muttered. But Mark brushed it off. It was an old house. Of course, it had history. The first night passed quietly, mostly. At 3 a.m., Evelyn woke up. A whisper, faint, almost like a breath against her ear. Help me. She shot up in bed, heart racing. Mark was still asleep. She turned toward the closet. The door was slightly ajar. Hadn't they closed it before bed? She stared for a long moment, then shook her head. Just my imagination, she whispered to herself, lying back down. But as she drifted off, she heard it again. A whisper, a plea. Help me. Evelyn tried to ignore it. She blamed exhaustion, stress, even the old pipes. But the voice kept coming back. Every night. Always at 3 a.m. Always from the closet. Mark never heard it. You're just adjusting to the house, he reasoned. It's probably creaking from the cold. But it wasn't creaking. It was whispering. And the more she ignored it, the more desperate it became. One night, she finally gathered the courage to open the closet. It was empty. Just old coats, a few hangers, and dust. But as she turned to close it, she saw something. A faint outline of scratches on the back wall. Deep, jagged, like claw marks. Her stomach twisted. She stepped closer, running her fingers over them. And then, a breath against her neck. She spun around. Nothing. Mark stirred in bed. Eve, what are you doing? She hesitated. Nothing, she whispered, shutting the closet door. But she knew something was in there. The next morning, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She stood before the closet again, daylight making it feel less terrifying. She needed to check. She grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver. She traced the scratches again, then pressed against the wood. It was hollow. With shaking hands, she pried the wooden panel loose. Dust and rot filled the air. Behind the panel was a small hidden compartment, barely big enough for a child to crawl into. And inside, a pair of eyes stared back at her. Evelyn screamed, stumbling backward. The flashlight fell, flickering. Mark ran into the room. What's wrong? She pointed. But when he shone the flashlight inside, it was empty. Just a small, dark hole. There was someone in there, she gasped. Mark examined the space. It's just an old hideout, maybe for storage. But Evelyn saw the way his fingers trembled as he touched the edges of the hole. He was trying to reassure her, but he felt it too. Something was there, watching. That night, Evelyn refused to sleep. She set up her phone to record. If there was something in that closet, she'd catch it. At exactly 3 a.m., the whisper started again. Help me. The voice was young, fragile. The closet door creaked open by itself. And then, a different voice, low, guttural. You can't leave. The bedroom door slammed shut. Evelyn screamed, bolting up. Mark jolted awake. The closet door was wide open. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking as she replayed the recording. The whispers were clear, and then a sound, a child crying. She turned to Mark. We need to find out what happened here. Evelyn dug through old newspaper archives. She found an article from 20 years ago. Local girl, Emily Carter, missing. Last seen in her bedroom. The picture showed a child's face, her eyes filled with fear. Evelyn's stomach twisted. She flipped through the pages until she found another article, months later. Father dies in tragic suicide. House abandoned. The details were vague, but Evelyn knew. Emily never left the house. She was still here, in the closet. Evelyn couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, she waited until Mark fell asleep. Then, she returned to the closet. Help me. Tears welled in her eyes. Emily, she whispered. The whisper stopped. The air felt heavier. Evelyn grabbed a hammer. She struck the wall behind the hidden compartment. The wood splintered. And then, something fell out. A small skeleton, wrapped in a tattered dress. A single red ribbon tied to the brittle hair. Evelyn stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. She turned to run, but the closet slammed shut behind her. Darkness, and then breathing. Right next to her. You found me. A small, icy hand touched her shoulder. Evelyn screamed. Mark woke to his wife's screams. He bolted upright. Evelyn was inside the closet, the door rattling violently. "Eve!" He lunged forward, pulling it open. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. But behind her, in the darkness, something moved. A shadowy figure, tall, with hollow eyes and razor-sharp fingers. Mark yanked Evelyn away just as the thing lunged. The closet slammed shut. For a moment, there was silence, then scratching. Mark grabbed Evelyn and ran. As they fled the house, they heard it one last time. A whisper, a child's voice. "Thank you." But beneath it, another voice, deep, hungry. "She was mine." They never went back. The police found the remains of Emily Carter behind the wall. The case was closed, finally, but the house remained, and sometimes, at 3 a.m., passers-by could see the closet door creak open and hear the whispers. "Help me." Story 6. The Candle That Never Burns Out. A Tale of Terror and Madness. Ethan Holloway never expected to inherit anything from his estranged uncle, Reginald Ashford. The man had been a reclusive scholar, obsessed with ancient relics and occult knowledge. When news came of his sudden death, Ethan was summoned to the Ashford estate, a decaying mansion nestled deep in the fog-choked forests of Black Hollow. The air smelled of damp wood and old parchment as Ethan entered the house. The lawyer, a pale man named Mr. Whitmore, handed him a small, dust-covered box. "This," Whitmore said gravely, "is your uncle's most prized possession. His final wish was for you to take it." Inside the box lay a candle, tall, black as coal, and cold to the touch. Ethan frowned. A candle. Whitmore's face remained expressionless. "Your uncle spent years researching its origins. It is said to never burn out." Ethan chuckled nervously. "A trick candle, that's all." Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. "Light it, Mr. Holloway. You will see." That night, alone in his new home, Ethan examined the candle. There were strange markings carved into the wax, runes he couldn't decipher. Shrugging off his unease, he struck a match and set the wick alight. The flame roared to life, casting long, writhing shadows across the room. Something about the way it flickered felt unnatural, as if it moved with intention. He blew at it. The flame didn't even waver. Frowning, Ethan tried again. This time, cupping his hands and exhaling sharply. Nothing. The flame stood defiantly. His unease deepened when he noticed something strange. The candle wasn't melting. The wax remained solid, untouched by the heat. He reached for a glass of water and poured it over the flame. Steam hissed, but the fire remained. It burned, steady and unyielding. A cold shiver ran down his spine. That was when he heard it. A whisper. A low, rasping voice curling through the air like smoke. "Do not extinguish me." Ethan's breath hitched. He spun around, but he was alone. The whisper came again, threading through the silence. "Do not extinguish me." The voice seemed to seep from the very walls, from the flickering shadows. Ethan grabbed the candle and stormed outside, his pulse hammering. He threw it onto the damp grass, hoping the wet earth would smother it. The candle remained lit. The whispering grew louder. Terrified, Ethan ran back inside and slammed the door. From the window, he saw the candle's glow, a lone ember in the darkness. It burned on, defying the night. Sleep did not come easy. Ethan tossed and turned, his mind replaying the eerie whispers. Then, at the stroke of midnight, a loud thud echoed from downstairs. He sat up, heart pounding. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. The candle's glow still shone from outside. Another thud, closer this time. Footsteps. Ethan grabbed a fireplace poker and crept down the stairs. The house was suffocatingly silent, except for the steady, rhythmic creaking of floorboards. Then he saw them. Shadowed figures moved along the walls, their outlines fluid and shifting. They twisted unnaturally, their elongated limbs stretching toward him. A sharp whisper sliced through the silence. "You lit the candle. Now we are free." Ethan's breath hitched. The figures slithered along the walls, closer, closer, black masses of writhing darkness. Panic surged through him. He ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows pressed in, whispering his name, hissing ancient incantations. Then the whispering stopped. The figures froze. Ethan turned, dreading what he would see. Standing at the foot of the stairs was a man. No, something that had once been a man. Uncle Reginald. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes burned with an unholy fire. "The candle must never go out," Reginald's voice rasped, but his lips did not move. Ethan shook his head. What is this?" Reginald's decayed fingers twitched. "I was a fool. I thought I could control it. The candle binds them, traps them in the flame." Ethan's stomach dropped. "The moment it goes out," Reginald continued, his hollow gaze drilling into Ethan's soul, "they will take you." The shadows writhed hungrily. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind reeling. "Then I'll destroy it." Reginald's head jerked violently. "No, if you break it, the horrors within will be unleashed upon the world." The room darkened. The whispering returned, dozens of voices, all murmuring in unison. "Let us out." Ethan felt a pressure against his skull, as if unseen hands were gripping his mind. His vision blurred. Then he understood. The candle wasn't just a relic, it was a prison. And now, it was his burden to bear. Morning came, but the house remained cold, lifeless. Ethan sat in the parlor, staring at the cursed candle. The flame burned on, unwavering. The shadows had retreated, but he could feel them lurking, waiting. His hands trembled. He couldn't leave. He couldn't sleep. If the candle ever went out, they would return. The realization settled like a stone in his gut. He was trapped. The whispering resumed, a slow, maddening chant. Ethan's grip tightened around the candle. His vision blurred. His mind teetered on the edge of reason. Outside, the sky darkened unnaturally. The flame flickered, and then, ever so slowly, it began to die. End. Story 7. The Man Who Never Blinks. A horror story. James Carter moved into the small town of Ravenwood, looking for peace. After years of living in the chaos of the city, he wanted solitude. He found it in an old Victorian house at the edge of town, where the nearest neighbour was just across the street, a man named Mr. Holloway. From the moment James arrived, something felt off. Mr. Holloway never seemed to leave his house, yet he was always there, standing at the window, staring. James tried waving at him once. No response. The man didn't move. At first, James thought it was just a trick of the light. Maybe Mr. Holloway was asleep, his eyes open. But then he saw it. Mr. Holloway never blinked. Not once. Days passed, and the eerie presence of Mr. Holloway became harder to ignore. Whether it was morning or night, rain or shine, James could always see him, motionless, his unblinking eyes locked onto James's house. One evening, James decided to test something. He sat by his own window and stared back. He kept his eyes wide open, refusing to blink, just like Mr. Holloway. Minutes passed, then an hour. His eyes burned, water trickling down his cheeks. But Mr. Holloway remained unchanged. James blinked, and in that split second, Mr. Holloway was suddenly closer. James gasped and fell backward. His heart pounded. He swore Mr. Holloway had been inside his house just for a fraction of a second. But when he looked again, the man was back at his window across the street, staring as if nothing had happened. That night, James couldn't sleep. He double-checked the locks, closed the curtains, and told himself he was imagining things. But at 3 a.m., something woke him. A soft creaking noise from the hallway. He held his breath, his body frozen. Then in the darkness, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Mr. Holloway. James's throat clenched in terror. The man stood impossibly still, his eyes wide open, unblinking. His mouth hung slightly open, but no breath came from it. James reached for his phone, but when he looked back up, Mr. Holloway was closer. James scrambled back. His shaking fingers barely managed to turn on the lamp. Mr. Holloway was gone, but the door to his bedroom was now open. The next morning, James visited the town's library. He needed answers. Who was Mr. Holloway? After hours of searching through dusty records, he found something terrifying. Harrison Holloway died in 1963. His obituary described a man who had suffered from a rare disorder. He could not blink, ever. Eventually, he was found dead in his house, his eyes wide open, his body rotting in a chair. But that wasn't the worst part. The reports mentioned something chilling. They found him in the house across the street, the one James Carter now lives in. James couldn't stay another night. He packed his bags, ready to leave before sunset. But as he grabbed his keys, his phone screen lit up. A message. It was a photo. A photo of his bedroom, taken from inside the room. James turned slowly. Mr. Holloway stood inches away, his eyes locked onto James, his mouth stretched into a horrid, soundless grin. James screamed as the lights flickered and died. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him. Holloway's face, right in front of his own. And for the first time, in the silence of the night, James forgot to blink. Weeks later, a new tenant moved into the house. He noticed the neighbor across the street, a man standing at the window, never blinking, always watching. And inside the house, in the darkness of the bedroom, James Carter sat in a chair, eyes wide open. He never blinked again. The end. Story 8. The door that locks itself. Daniel Carter had always been skeptical of ghost stories. As a journalist for the Daily Tribune, he spent most of his career debunking urban legends. So, when he was assigned to investigate a supposedly haunted house on Blackwood Lane, he accepted it as just another job. The house had been abandoned for over a decade. The last owner, a man named Harold Grayson, had disappeared without a trace. The only thing left behind was the house itself, an old Victorian structure with a reputation for being cursed. Locals whispered about strange occurrences, lights flickering when the house had no electricity, shadowy figures seen in the windows, and, most disturbingly, a door that locked itself. Daniel dismissed the rumors as nonsense. With his flashlight and recording equipment, he entered the house alone. The moment he stepped inside, the air felt wrong. It was heavy, thick, almost suffocating. The wooden floor groaned under his boots as he made his way through the dusty hallway. The house smelled of mold and decay. Cobwebs hung like curtains in every corner. His flashlight revealed peeling wallpaper and furniture covered in white sheets. The house was silent, unnervingly so. He set up his camera in the main hall, speaking into his recorder. "This is Daniel Carter, reporting from the infamous Grayson house. As expected, nothing unusual so far." Then he heard it. A click. The unmistakable sound of a door locking behind him. Daniel turned sharply. The front door, the very door he had walked through, was locked. He jiggled the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He frowned. The lock was old-fashioned, a heavy iron bolt that had to be moved manually. He hadn't touched it. Maybe the wind, he muttered, though he didn't believe it. Still, he wasn't worried. He had seen doors close on their own before. He continued deeper into the house. Then it happened again. Click. Another door locked, this time the one leading to the dining room. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. He turned, gripping his flashlight. "Hello, anyone there?" His voice echoed in the empty house. Silence. Then, footsteps. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The sound came from the second floor. Slow, deliberate footsteps creaked against the wooden floor above. Someone, or something, was up there. His rational mind told him it had to be an animal, a raccoon maybe. But another sound followed. Not footsteps this time, but a whisper, a voice, low, indistinct. Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't alone. He forced himself to climb the stairs, flashlight shaking in his grip. The air grew colder with each step. His breath turned visible in the dim light. At the top of the stairs, he saw something that made his blood freeze. A door, slowly closing on its own, and then, click, it locked. Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His instinct screamed at him to leave, but the locked doors meant he had no escape. He approached the locked room. It was a bedroom. The name Harold Grayson was etched into the wooden door. A loud bang echoed from inside. Something was in there. Daniel reached for the knob with trembling fingers. It was ice cold. He turned it, expecting resistance, but the door swung open with eerie ease. Inside the room was pristine, untouched by time. A single chair sat in the middle facing a mirror, and in the reflection, Daniel saw a figure standing behind him. A tall, shadowy man with hollow eyes. Daniel spun around. Nothing was there. The mirror's reflection, however, remained unchanged. The figure stood still, staring at him. Then, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel's heart pounded. The voice was deep, guttural, wrong. The door behind him slammed shut. Click. The lock engaged on its own. Panic set in. He ran to the door, yanking at the knob. It wouldn't move. In the mirror, the figure took a step closer. Daniel screamed. The next morning, authorities arrived at Blackwood Lane. A local resident had reported strange noises coming from the house overnight. They found Daniel's camera in the main hall, still recording, but Daniel was gone. The only thing left behind was the sound on the tape, a whisper playing over and over again. "The door locks itself. The door locks itself. The door locks itself." And then, a final click, the sound of a door locking. Forever. The end. Story 9. The Train That Never Stops. It was called The Endless Train. No one knew where it came from, and no one knew where it was going. Those who boarded it never came back. Some said it was a cursed train, a ghostly apparition that preyed on lost souls. Others claimed it was a doorway to another world, a limbo where time ceased to exist. But for David Carter, a desperate man on the run, it was his last hope for escape. David ran through the rain-soaked streets, his breath ragged, his heartbeat a drum against his ribs. The men chasing him were getting closer. He could hear their footsteps splashing in the puddles behind him. He needed to disappear, to find a place where no one would ever find him. That was when he saw it. A train, sleek and black as midnight, waiting at the station. There were no passengers, no conductor, just an open door beckoning him inside. It was strange. The last train was supposed to have left hours ago, but David didn't care. He jumped inside just as the train whistled and began to move. As he collapsed into a seat, catching his breath, he realized something odd. There were no signs, no advertisements, no maps, nothing to indicate where the train was going. The only sound was the steady click-clack of the wheels against the tracks. He exhaled. Maybe he had gotten lucky. Maybe this was just an old service train heading out of the city. He was wrong. David sat in uneasy silence, taking in his surroundings. The train had a strange, old-fashioned design. The seats were velvet, the windows fogged over, and the dim overhead lights flickered occasionally. Then he noticed the other passengers. They sat unnaturally still, their faces obscured by shadows. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if they weren't real, just mannequins dressed in old tattered clothing. A shiver ran down his spine. Trying to shake the feeling, he turned toward the nearest passenger, a woman in a faded red dress. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. "Do you know where this train is headed?" The woman slowly turned her head. David gasped. Her face was gaunt, her skin sickly pale, and her eyes completely black. "You shouldn't have gotten on," she whispered. David's breath caught in his throat. Before he could react, the lights flickered off, plunging the train into darkness. And then the screaming began. The train shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. The lights flickered back on for a brief moment, revealing the passengers standing now, staring directly at him with hollow eyes. Then darkness again. A chorus of whispers filled the air, overlapping voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. "Let us out. Join us. It never stops. It never stops." David's pulse pounded. He stumbled backward, pressing himself against the cold metal walls. When the lights flickered back on, the passengers were gone. He was alone, or so he thought. A presence loomed behind him. The air turned ice cold. Slowly, unwillingly, he turned his head. A towering figure stood inches away. Its face was wrapped in decayed bandages, only its mouth visible, twisted into a grotesque grin. "Welcome," it rasped. "You can never leave." David bolted, running through the cars, past empty seats and shattered windows. The train had no end, just car after car, each identical to the last. Then, up ahead, he saw a door marked Conductor's Cabin. With trembling hands, he forced it open. Inside, an ancient man sat hunched over a rusted control panel, his skeletal fingers gripping the levers. His sunken eyes locked onto David. "You shouldn't be here," the conductor murmured. "Please stop the train," David begged. "I need to get off." The conductor chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "There is no getting off," he said. "Not unless it takes someone else." David froze. "The train," the conductor continued, "needs a soul to keep running. That's the rule. That's the price." A horrible realization dawned on David. If he wanted to escape, someone else had to take his place. Desperation clawed at his mind. There had to be another way, but then he heard it. The sound of footsteps. The passengers were coming back. David backed against the controls. "Please," he whispered. "There has to be another way." The conductor tilted his head. "There is, but it's not one you'll like." David swallowed hard. His hands shook as he reached for the emergency brake. If he couldn't escape, he could at least stop the train. The conductor smiled. "Good luck." David pulled the brake. The train screamed. The walls trembled. The windows shattered. And then everything went black. Rain poured over the deserted station. A young woman ran through the empty streets, breathless, desperate to escape the danger behind her. That was when she saw it. A train, sleek and black as midnight, waiting at the station. The doors were open, waiting. She hesitated. But then she heard voices approaching. Her pursuers were close. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The doors slammed shut. The train whistled, and it never stopped. Story 10. The Shadow That Follows, a horror story. Jonathan Graves had always been a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. But that was before the shadow came. It started with small things. A flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. A dark smudge in his reflection that wasn't there when he turned around. At first, he blamed exhaustion. His job as a journalist often had him working late into the night, and he convinced himself that sleep deprivation was playing tricks on him. But then, the presence grew bolder. One evening, while working in his home office, he felt something behind him, a cold, suffocating weight in the air. Slowly, he turned to the mirror on the opposite wall. His reflection stood still, frozen in place. But behind him, was a shadow. Not his shadow. It had no face, no form, just an amorphous darkness stretching unnaturally long across the floor. Jonathan spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. It was the first time he truly felt fear. As the days passed, the shadow became more aggressive. It followed him everywhere. No matter how bright the lights were, there was always a corner of darkness creeping toward him. At night, he heard whispering, too low to make out, but enough to send chills down his spine. One night, as he was lying in bed, he felt it, a pressure on his chest, like someone was leaning over him. His breath hitched. Slowly, he opened his eyes. The room was completely dark, but in that darkness, something moved. A shifting, pulsating mass of blackness, hovering just inches from his face. His body froze, locked in terror. The whispering grew louder, swirling around him like a storm of voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. And then it touched him. A cold, inky tendril wrapped around his wrist. A searing pain shot through his arm, and he screamed, jerking away. He bolted upright, switching on the lamp. The room was empty, but his wrist was burning. A bruise-like mark had appeared, black and veiny, spreading across his skin like a disease. It wasn't just following him anymore. It was claiming him. Desperation led Jonathan to seek answers. He scoured books, forums, even visited an old occult bookstore downtown. The owner, an old woman with clouded eyes, took one look at him and recoiled. "It has marked you," she whispered. Jonathan begged her for help. "You must find where it began," she said, "or it will take you into the dark with it." Where it began, Jonathan thought back. The first time he saw the shadow was a week ago, right after his trip to Ravenwood, an abandoned town he had visited for an article. There, he had explored a crumbling house, a house filled with strange symbols carved into the walls. He had felt something there, something watching. Had he brought it back with him? There was only one way to find out. The town of Ravenwood was silent when Jonathan arrived. The air was thick, heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The house stood exactly as he had left it, decayed, forgotten, but alive in a way that made his skin crawl. As he stepped inside, his flashlight flickered. The darkness seemed to drink in the light. He could feel it now, stronger than ever. It was waiting for him. He moved deeper into the house, following an invisible pull until he reached the room where he had first felt it. The walls were covered in those same strange symbols. His breath caught. In the center of the floor was a symbol different from the rest. A large, blackened stain. A shadow. The whispering returned, louder now, almost deafening. The walls seemed to shift, stretch. The darkness swirled, gathering in the center of the room. And then it rose. A figure formed from the blackness, tall and featureless. Its body rippled like ink in water, tendrils extending toward him. Jonathan stumbled back, but the door slammed shut. "You took my place," the voices hissed, merging into one. Memories not his own flooded his mind. Visions of another man, long ago, trapped in this very room. A ritual, a sacrifice. The shadow was not a spirit. It was a curse that needed a new host to be free. "You let me out," it whispered. "Now you must stay." Jonathan screamed as the darkness engulfed him. It wrapped around him, seeping into his skin, filling his lungs. He tried to fight, but it was too strong. The last thing he saw before the world turned to black was his own reflection in the window. But it wasn't his reflection anymore. It was the shadow. Days later, a group of urban explorers found the house. One of them, a young man named Eric, noticed something strange. A large, dark stain on the floor. As he stepped closer, he felt a chill run down his spine. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. A whisper in the air. And then, the shadow followed him home. Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home. At first, it was subtle. The way his shadow stretched unnaturally long in the dim light, or how the darkness in his room never seemed fully black, but instead pulsed like something alive. Then came the whispers. Late at night, just as he was about to fall asleep, he would hear them. Faint, distant voices murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. But then, one night, he saw it, standing at the foot of his bed. A tall, faceless shadow, shifting like ink, tendrils slowly reaching toward him. Eric froze, unable to move, unable to scream. A suffocating pressure pressed down on his chest as the shadow loomed closer, whispering in that dreadful ancient voice, "You let me in." His body convulsed as cold tendrils wrapped around his arms, his legs, his throat. The darkness poured into him, filling every inch of his being. He couldn't fight it. He didn't want to. The last thought that flickered through his mind before he was swallowed whole was the realization that he wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Days later, Eric's friends reported him missing. The police searched his apartment. Everything was in place. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. Just an eerie silence and a strange dark stain on the floor near his bed. And in the dim glow of the evening light, if you looked closely, you could almost see it. A shadow that didn't belong to anyone. Waiting, watching, hungry for the next soul to take its place. The end, or is it?